Thank you to all who've become a Patreon of MythVision Podcast and Dr. Robert M. Price's Patreon. I really appreciate it. You guys are making this possible. There are hundreds of videos that have not been released to the public here on YouTube that you gain access to by becoming one. So thank you for your support. Let's get to Dr. Price. Dr. Price. Question again from Sergio Zanier. He is a patron of MythVision Podcast. Thank you for being a patron, my friend. 500 appears a popular number in the Buddhist lore. 500 arhats?
Arhat.
Arhats.
Those who have attained nirvana in this life.
Interesting. 500 arhats attended the first council. Various elders, Purana, Mahakassapa, Sariputta, Magallana, I guess I'm trying, traveled with a retinue of 500 monks even during the Buddhist lifetime. Jesus, too. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time.
I see somebody's reading the new RSV.
Yeah.
It doesn't say "and sisters."
Right. Either way, 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. 1 Corinthians 15:6. Regards. So, anyway, let me get over here real quick just to show you some of these names. Purana.
Mahakasyapa was associated with the founding of Zen. Purana that's also the name of a bunch of scriptures. I'm not familiar with his personal name. Sariputra or Putta, that's the difference between Sanskrit and Pali. He was the right-hand man. In fact, the late, great Christian Lintner said that he thought that Sariputra was the same as Simon Peter. He occupies the same niche, and of course...
In Sanskrit, it has that.
And of course, Christian Lintner thought that the whole Jesus story is a retelling of the Buddha story. Moggallana, I don't know that one. But yeah, he did have a bunch of big disciples. Mahakasyapa was, the Buddha on one occasion was asked to set forth his dharma or his doctrine, and he picked up a golden lotus and just held it up. And Mahakasyapa nodded in comprehension. He was the only one who did. And that's the beginning of Zen, where you don't need rational discourse because talk doesn't cook the rice. You have to see things in a new way. And that's what Mahakasyapa had done. He was able to see the real thing. I know what he meant. I had that happen once. Where I was kind of upset because of things that were going on, driving some friends along a highway in Michigan, and suddenly, I mention the upset business because I think this kind of thing happens when you're not quite yourself. You've been knocked off balance. Suddenly, the scenery around me, as mundane as it could be, just leaped into a living focus that is hard to describe, but suddenly I couldn't take it for granted, and it was a feeling of ecstasy. And so I've always thought that's what they're talking about. When I was enlightened, before I was enlightened, a mountain was just a mountain. When I was enlightened, it wasn't a mountain anymore. But since then, it's a mountain again.
Wow.
I find it fascinating, just to comment on that, to connect the 500 and 500, because I think there's an interesting there, and I'd like to get your comment. But these experiences, people have all these strange explanations for them, and they think it's some type of supernatural or something beyond. even if we can explain them, you're saying chemical reactions based on something that was in the frontal lobe cortex, or could give all the natural explanations, it doesn't mean that there's not purpose in these experiences that I think are so valid and we give labels to. So as much as we spend time dissecting these religions, dissecting their meanings and their mythologies and stuff, I think it's a human thing to experience these things, and things like Buddha, Jesus and Christianity, and experiences people have, whatever. They attribute those feelings and just have their own flavor of Kool-Aid, if you will, that they like to have it in. But what I like doing is finding the natural explanation and still see these experiences as just as valid. Whereas a lot of atheists that go out there spend so much time bashing religions, very little time kind of saying, look, these experiences are still valid and great to have, you know? And so I can vouch when I've seen the world through a different lens and know, you know, that leaf matters now. That tree matters. I didn't give a crap about that tree for 20 years of my life. Now, that tree is everything. It's amazing. I'm glad that tree's there. It brings shade, and it looks so pretty. In this fall time, when the leaves are falling, whatever, you know, you get a new experience out of it. And so,
You wonder if that's not the root experience of the story, like Moses and the burning bush, that it blazed with a kind of new light somehow. Even if you can explain it, well, you'd have to explain it. It was like I was saying another time, like Thales said, does it rain because Zeus says, let's have some rain? Maybe so, but how? There must be a way that it happens. And otherwise, you're just talking about cartoons. And I think that's exactly right. A militant atheist friend of mine, Eddie Tabash, who's a big-time lawyer and he was a buddy of Obama and so on. He works for the Council for Secular Humanism. He was involved in martial arts and said that he had transcendent mystical experiences, and that looking back, he still thinks they were quite meaningful and wholesome, though he doesn't believe there's a God. William James, in his great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he talks about naturalists and atheists that had these smashing experiences of oneness with nature. They didn't draw any ontological implications from it. It didn't make them think, oh, I was wrong, there is a God. It wasn't really a question of that. It was an altered perception, but it didn't have ontological, it didn't prove anything. And nor is it supposed to, because this idea that, well, now we can say it was the temporal parietal lobe. Yeah, no doubt it was. I accept that. But it's like when you watch one of these TV documentaries, The Making of Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings, I don't want to see that. I don't want to autopsy the experience of wonder. If it was brought about in some way, well, I knew that. That's no surprise. But I don't want to see it dissected like a corpse on an autopsy table. Because that's like letting the air out of the tire. You're just trying to debunk it, practically. And or here's one, speaking of the Council for Secular Humanism, at a conference once, we had this guy who'd been on TV a bunch of times, setting up these sort of experiment things that you wouldn't have thought possible. Like, he had this pot of molten lead and dunked his hand into it. Not a blister, nothing, because there's enough of a little air glove around your hand that if you just put it in there, it insulates you for a very short time. So if you left it in there, you'd be minus a hand, but nobody does that. And he explained it, and then he had this big bed of coals bigger than the floor of this room, I guess, that had been stoking for some hours. And so there was ash on the coals. And he invited people to take their shoes off and walk barefoot over these coals that were still something like 900 degrees. And so I took him up on it. And he said, well, this won't hurt you unless you just stand there, because the ash covering the coals it is so absorbent, it sucks up all the heat. And so you're in no danger. It's like warm beach sand. Well, okay, I understood that, but nonetheless, I walked over hot coals. It didn't in the least lessen the impact of it. And it's like the special effects in religious services with incense and stained glass. Oh, that's all special effects. Of course, obviously it is. But it's calculated to facilitate a certain state of consciousness, and it works. What is the problem with that? Nobody's being hornswoggled here.
Absolutely not. And that's why these experiences are great. I mean, I personally want to know the natural explanation. For me, I know you don't care to, well, you probably care about that too. I'm just saying you don't want to like dissect it where there's no magic left.
Yeah.
No, I mean, if I found out that my brain was able to produce such magical things, I'd want to know, how do I enact it quicker? Is there something I can do to make it happen quicker? Now, of course, there are other religious things. Oh yeah, meditate, don't eat for 40 days. There's ways to get these things, put yourself through a little suffering so that when there is pleasure, you're going to go, pleasure's so much better. Because it's like, for me, I used to do this as a kid, and I'm not exaggerating. I would jump into the freezing cold pool during the winter, but my mom had a hot tub, and the hot tub stayed 104 degrees, nice and hot and bubbly. And we'd get in the hot tub, our muscles would relax and loosen. I'd go jump in this freezing, I'm talking about, my balls ended up in my stomach, okay? Like, I was freezing. Got out, like, lips are blue, freaking dying, jump in the hot tub again.
Wow.
Like, purposely experienced the contrast to heighten the sense of the warmth. And the relaxation. Same thing goes for like hardcore workout or whatever it might be. So I wonder if there's ways to unlock that. You're not just looking at a tree, you're looking at a tree. It has purpose, it has meaning now. Like, what do you do? But to the beginning of the question, initially in this video, 500. Do you think there's a correlation between the 500 there and the 500 Buddha? Or do you think Pentecost is really the real reason and or origin for that? Do you think that's the better explanation? Someone actually commented and asked in that video, was like, do you think Pentecost better explains the 500 there, and that is a misinterpretation of the Greek?
It could well be. It's another one of those things where that is not far-fetched. It's entirely plausible. But it seems to me to make a bit more sense if you posit that the 500 is, which has to be a later interpolation, because no gospel hints at such a thing, and if it was believed to have happened, you'd be reading it in every gospel. So where then does it come from? And I think it makes better sense because the narrative context in the Gospel of Nicodemus is more like the way it's described, albeit very briefly, in 1 Corinthians 15, in the context of resurrection appearances.
How late do you think it is?
That's probably written in the 300s, the 4th century. But who knows how much before that it could have originated. You can never really know. You can't assume that it's older than that, but you can't assume that it's that somebody just made it up immediately on the day that text was written. And so it seems to me, and since we don't have copies of 1 Corinthians from the period in which an interpolation would have been made. It's guesswork any way you cut it, but I just find that so striking that I favor that explanation, though the other one is certainly plausible.
And let's play down the misinterpretation, or let's say it wasn't a misinterpretation, and maybe it is, but I'm saying Pentecost being very similar in Greek. If it's trying to kind of denote the original Christians, if you will, that were the collective group, not the apostles, or as Paul calls them, apostles, not disciples. I do think it's interesting that they're trying to like kind of hint at the original guys, because they're already mentioning the first people who had visions. You know, they're trying to like build a foundation inside of the creed. Oh, it was him, to me, and last of all me, and Paul's writing this, or whoever it is. It sounds like he's trying to base some foundation story to the origin of this creed and this belief called Christianity. So, looking at Acts and Pentecost in the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, it does sound like, hey, here's how this thing all started out, kind of like. Originally Jews, and here are the guys that were part of this. Do you think that plays into Acts? This Corinthian passage plays into Acts, almost like whoever wrote this knew about Acts of the Apostles?
Well, they probably would have if I would think that Acts, though a second century work, is older than the Gospel of Nicodemus. So it could well be that they knew about it. They certainly knew about the Gospels, because of the things quoted, like people are reporting to Pilate all the stuff Jesus did, and it's pretty obviously taken from there. But in 1 Corinthians 15, I think the list of appearances was originally a set of credentials that like in 1 Corinthians 9:1, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? As if the one was tantamount to the other, that if you hadn't had a resurrection appearance, you couldn't be an apostle. Or as I say, it's framed like a creed, which is a whole different thing. But is he trying to prove the resurrection happened? I don't think so, because the rest of the epistle of chapter 15 assumes that the Corinthians do believe in the resurrection of Jesus. The problem is any future resurrection of believers, because he argues, if you're ruling out a resurrection on principle, Jesus couldn't have risen either. You don't think that, which implies he doesn't need to prove that to them. Though whoever compiled that list might have thought so. But again, I stick by saying that a creed is a statement of beliefs, not a statement of proof for beliefs. So I think that's a big problem there. One other thing with the Buddhism thing, J. Duncan M. Derritt wrote a piece for the Journal of Higher Criticism where he said that you could explain both the return of the saints in Matthew at the time of the crucifixion, appearing to other people alive again, and the 500 people in 1 Corinthians 15 by saying that they're both derived from a Buddhist text in which the earth opens up and 500 bodhisattvas, the super enlightened monks, who have been dwelling there for, I don't know what reason, come out and manifest themselves. And this kind of proves the truth of what the Buddha is saying. Well, that's not too bad either as an explanation. And it's unfamiliar to people, but that doesn't mean it's not true. I mentioned earlier about the plausibility structures and so forth with Peter Berger. Stanley Fish talks the same way in a great book called By the way, why am I always saying this and that's a great book? Well, I'm not going to be quoting crummy books. Why should I? Well, this book is called "Is There a Text in This Class?" And the subtitle is "The Authority of Interpretive Communities." And among many other things, he says that what seems to you as the natural reading of a text may seem that way only because everybody in your group thinks that and has always thought it. And I think there's really something to that. When you, what are you talking about? It doesn't mean that it really is far-fetched. It's just alien to you, which is really kind of frightening, actually.
Thank you, Dr. Bob.